Welcome everyone. We're here today to talk about MTSS and the use of special education funds in the MTSS process. So my name is Angelisa Broxma Fine Art. I work at Great Prairie AEA as an associate administrator.
And I'm Sarah Brown. I work at the Department of Education as a Bureau Chief for Learner Strategies and Supports.
So we are both part of the State Special Education Directors Group and the work team for MTSS. So we were asked to put together some information about how an AEA can use special ed funds, or how an AEA and LEA can use special ed funds to support the work of MTSS.
So MTSS is implemented in more and more Iowa schools as part of our C4K work, clarification has been requested regarding how staff who are funded through special education monies can provide support to this work. The collaborative inquiry questions were used as a guide to discuss appropriate use of funds for MTSS purposes. And so there's a document that corresponds with this presentation that goes through the collaborative inquiry questions and describes for each question how MTSS funds may be used. The collaborative inquiry questions are organized into three main sections: one around consensus, one section around infrastructure and implementation, and one around sustainability.
So first, let's talk about consensus. Basically, the first question that we look at within the collaborative inquiry process is, what is the current level of consensus for MTSS? So we want teams to have an understanding of MTSS, we want school staff to understand what it is, and to build their consensus and support for that type of work. So what are some ways that special ed staff might engage in this work? They might be able to provide an overview of MTSS to building staff members with fellow administrators or leadership team members. And they would want to make sure that they include a focus on implications for learners who are in special education. So we know that those special education students are a part of that entire continuum. So we want to make sure that we're pointing that out as we're having that presentation. They might also provide information about the rationale for why a building needs to start MTSS, and that would include a focus on the potential benefits for students in special education. They could also support the work by answering questions about implementation of MTSS, implications, outcome, rationale, those sorts of things. Or they could be a participant on the team that's actually developing the consensus activities, as long as we're making the connection to the needs of learners with disabilities. Really, the main point in thinking about how you can use funds to support MTSS is, what's the connection to special education, or what's the connection to students with significant learning needs or learners with disabilities. So as long as we're able to make that connection, we're able to use our funds to help support that work.
Additionally, if you'll notice, this says provide an overview of MTSS to building staff. It does not say provide all of the training related to MTSS on an ongoing basis for building staff. And so the fact that it's also a one-time training also plays into the reason that it's an appropriate use of funds. Also around consensus, one of the questions that we're answering is, if the current level of consensus isn't sufficient, what is the process to build consensus? And so team members may be determining what next steps would be in developing action plans around consensus if they currently don't have consensus for MTSS implementation within their building. So a staff member who's fully funded from special education funds or partially funded, using that time, they may be helping a team identify questions and concerns from staff members, especially those involved in the provision of interventions and special education services. They may also be providing leadership teams with answers or resources related to questions pertaining to general education interventions, suspicion of disability, evaluation for special education services, and the provision of special education. So for example, they may participate on the team that's developing activities because specifically they're consulting regarding beliefs and connections to the needs of learners with disabilities. A non-example would be if a team member that was paid for with special education funding were facilitating the development of consensus surveys and or activities. So if they're facilitating the development of all of it and they're really running that process and leading that process, that would not be an appropriate use of funds, because that's really looking at the entire level of consensus for MTSS. It's not focused on specifically making connections to needs of learners with disabilities.
So our last question under consensus is about the leadership team. The question is there a leadership team established to support the development, implementation, and sustainability of the framework? So often the question we get here is, I'm a person who's funded by special ed dollars, 100% funded by special ed. Can I be a regular member of the leadership team? The answer is, it depends. We know for sure that you can participate as a member of the leadership team on an occasional and incidental basis. So if your MTSS leadership team is meeting and on the agenda for that day's discussion is the identification of students for child find purposes or how we're addressing the needs of students in special ed through specially designed instruction, or we're looking at data related to students who are in special ed, you can definitely participate. That definitely falls under the appropriate use of funds because we're connected to special education and it's occasional and incidental. You're there just for that day while they're having that relevant conversation. You might be able to participate as a regular and ongoing leadership team member, however, if the purpose of your representing if your purpose of being on the team is to represent the special education population, so to talk about those students who are in special ed, to talk specifically about their needs, to talk about their involvement in the MTSS system and the continuum of services, or to talk about interventions and specially designed instruction for students who are in special education. So if you're a regular member, the purpose for you being a regular member really is to represent special education. If you're a regular member and your purpose is to represent what we're doing for all kids or to represent what we're doing for universal instruction, core instruction for everyone, then that would not be an appropriate use of special education dollars.
The second set of collaborative inquiry questions are around infrastructure and implementation. The first question in this section is the universal tier sufficient? Oftentimes we've received questions around, can special education staff participate in universal screening? And the answer, yet again, is it depends. And really, we're asking about how and why. And so we can assist in universal screening if we're talking about planning and administration for learners with disabilities. So you might be deciding about accommodations, you might be helping think about looking at IEPs and what accommodations are set in IEPs, and things like that. You may also assist in universal screening administration for learners who are at risk as part of the child find process. And so if you are working with students already who are at risk or with learners who have disabilities, then you may participate in that universal screening administration for those students. You may also participate as a SWAT team member. A SWAT team is a word that people around the state use for a team of individuals that are responsible for assessing all learners in the building during those universal screening times. And so if your purpose on that SWAT team is to assess learners with disabilities and those who are at risk or as part of the child find process, then you may participate as a SWAT team member.
So Sarah, can I stop and ask you a question?
Of course.
So can I participate as a SWAT team member if my job on the SWAT team is to assess all the second graders?
No, so that would not be an appropriate use of special education funds. So when we're talking about doing all second graders, really what you're talking about is something that's really a core universal tier activity and not an activity that's a special education specific activity.
Thanks.
You can also assist in data analysis of the core. And so when we're answering the question, is the universal tier sufficient? We're really answering that by looking at that universal screening data. And so you may specifically be looking at those data and determining the outcomes of learners in special education services. So for those who may be looking at getting reading services or those who aren't receiving reading services, you may be looking at the outcomes for those learners. You may also be looking at those data as you're determining the building special education identification rate. So you may be comparing those data, your identification rate, to the rate across the state, as is done during the collaborative inquiry process. So an example of an appropriate use of funds as you're answering the question, is the universal tier sufficient, is if you have a speech-language pathologist who's assessing learners on their caseload who have articulation services in order to make sure that we get the most accurate and valid score. A non-example would be if you are responsible for doing all of the logistics for universal screening implementation. So scheduling when second grade is going to be taking their assessment, or training staff and how to administer the assessments. So again, the purpose needs to be related to special education or learners who have IEPs or as part of the child find process.
Question number 2 is, if the universal tier is not sufficient, what are the needs that must be addressed? So in question number 2, we're really looking at if my universal tier doesn't meet the needs of a large number of my students in my building, what do we need to do differently in the universal tier to better support our students? So really, once again, you need to think about how this connects to the students who are in special education or students who have significant learning needs. So you might be using your staff members who are funded by special ed dollars to support the examination of staff members' beliefs about the purpose of the universal tier for learners in special education. So we really want staff members to understand and believe that the universal tier is for everyone and all students are held accountable to the Iowa Core standards or the Iowa Early Learning Standards. So you might assist in that examination of beliefs about, do we really think that students in special education can achieve the standards in the Iowa Core, for example? You might also be working with your team to ensure that learners in special education have access to the building blocks of the universal tier. And when we talk about the building blocks of the universal tier, those are the big chunks of content that we've had teams examine to help determine what they may need to do differently to increase the sufficiency of their core instruction or the instruction they're providing to everyone. So for example, you might be looking at for learners who are in special education, do they actually have access to core reading instruction? Do they have access to the same amount of time of reading instruction as everyone else in the building? So you're really going through those building blocks with an eye on the implications for students in special education. You might also assist the leadership team in collecting and analyzing data related to the experiences of at-risk learners or learners with disabilities. So really looking within those building blocks, and when we're talking about data collection, you might be responsible for doing the data collection for those learners who are at risk or in special education. So we have some specific examples. So for example, you might participate in accommodation and modification planning to support the success of learners in special education within the universal tier. So we know that we want students in special ed to be receiving core instruction. So you might be supporting the process of working with special education and general education teachers to identify the appropriate accommodations and modifications they need in order to be successful in the universal tier or to benefit from the universal tier instruction. You might also help collect and analyze information about instructional time for learners with disabilities. A non-example here would be if you're part of the team that's collecting and analyzing information about all students and instructional time for all students. That would not be an appropriate use of special ed funds because that's more of a general education activity. It impacts everyone and it's about everyone as opposed to just being about learners with disabilities. Another example is participating in conversations about policies impacting learners with disabilities. So your building or district may have some policies in place that might impact our students in special education and their ability to access core instruction or participate in core instruction. So you might help with the analysis of those policies.
So once we determine the needs that need to be addressed, the third question in infrastructure and implementation is how will the universal tier needs be addressed? And so as we're moving forward, schools create action plans around addressing those things that they find as needs within their core. An appropriate use of special education funds in this area is to support the implementation of any prioritized area of needs that have direct connection to learners in special education. So let's look at some examples. First, you may be conducting training with staff regarding ensuring access to the universal tier for learners with disabilities. So if you collected data that said that we don't have access for learners with disabilities, you might be doing training for general education or special education staff around ensuring that access or providing accommodations and modifications. You may also be working with the building leadership team regarding scheduling for special education programming. Oftentimes, when we see universal tier needs action plans, we see things around ensuring that students with IEPs, with areas of reading identified as needs, that they have adequate time to address those needs. And so you may be helping with scheduling to ensure that students have access to that time. We also have non-examples. For instance, if you identify learning standards as a need for all teachers to learn more about, you providing training for all staff related to learning standards that really is supposed to support the success for all learners, not just learners with disabilities, that would be an inappropriate use of special education funds. In addition, if you worked with a building leadership team regarding all scheduling as opposed to scheduling for special education programming, again, that's not just looking at specifically learners with disabilities and their needs, and so it would be inappropriate use of funds.
So now let's talk about the last two questions that have to do with the universal tier. How will the implementation of the universal tier actions be monitored over time is question number 4. And here, if you're a staff member who's funded by special education dollars, you can assist the leadership team with ongoing monitoring or implementation of the changes or actions identified in their action plan that directly relate to the benefit of at-risk learners or learners with disabilities. So in the last question where Sarah talked about the examples of scheduling, as a special ed funded person, I could support the implementation, assessment, or monitoring of schedule changes for students in special education, but I could not support the monitoring of schedule changes for all students in the building. The last question is, have universal tier actions been effective? So here we're really looking at the overall outcomes. So as a special ed funded staff member, I could be reviewing student achievement data for learners with special education services and comparing their performance to established goals. I could definitely be looking at the achievement of students on their IEP goals in the area of reading. I could be reviewing implementation data for action items pertaining to learners with special education services or at-risk learners and comparing that to the established goals set by the team. And I could assist the team in analyzing data related to changes in the universal tier that support at-risk learners and learners with disabilities. Once again, the main point here is the connection to at-risk learners or learners with disabilities. If you're supporting the evaluation of the changes in the universal tier and it's directly connected to at-risk learners or learners with disabilities, you are able to engage in those activities. If the activities, however, are related to evaluating the impact of the changes in the universal tier for all students, that is not an allowable activity under the use of special ed funds.
The sixth collaborative inquiry question related to infrastructure and implementation is which students need support in addition to the universal tier. You may interact with this question with both students who have special education services and students without special education services. For those learners with special education services, you may be looking at which students' scores are substantially deficient and review their current specially designed instruction or special education services to ensure that the services are meeting their current needs. So for instance, for the vast majority of our students with disabilities, that they are making enough progress to eventually close the achievement gap. For learners without special education services, your work may be focused around assisting and identifying those learners whose universal screening scores are substantially deficient. You may be assisting the school to determine which of these students need targeted intervention and which may need more intensive intervention. In addition, for those learners whose scores are substantially deficient but do not already receive special education services, you may be having discussions about some of those students regarding whether a suspicion of disability is appropriate. Lastly, you may be providing consultation to LEA staff to support the implementation of the targeted or intensive general education interventions. If you'd like more specific information regarding the parameters of this consultation, again, you can refer to questions 22 and 54 in the Use of Special Education Funds question and answer document located on the Iowa Department of Education's website.
So now that we've identified the students who may need more support, what are we going to do about it? So are the students who need more support going to need targeted tier support, or are they going to need intensive tier support? And might we need to make modifications to their special education services? So once again, we're going to talk about the application of this question to learners with special education services and learners without special education services. So for students who are already in special education and we identify them as continuing to need support, what we want to do next is look at their growth. So when learners are not making expected growth, we would want to be assisting special educators in collecting additional diagnostic information that we might use to determine what else do we need to do for those students so that they are able to make growth, or what we need to intensify specifically in their specially designed instruction. In addition, when learners aren't making expected growth, we might assist the team in determining if we actually need to propose to do a reevaluation to collect more data than what we have right now. For learners who aren't in special education, we might assist the LEA in determining when additional diagnostic information needs to be collected for those targeted learners. So if you have a child who's been in an intervention for a while and they aren't making progress, do we need to go back and collect additional diagnostic information? You might also assist the LEA staff members with the diagnostic assessment process and help them to identify which assessments might need to be completed for each different learner that we've identified as a learner of concern. You might also assist LEA staff members with the interpretation of results of the diagnostic assessment process and provide them with instructional intervention recommendations for the general education interventions. So you might be helping them analyze the data that they've collected, pinpoint specific instructional needs, and then provide specific instructional recommendations to address those needs, all within that general education intervention process. And there's a note here that if you'd like more specific information regarding the parameters for this type of consultation around general education interventions, you can refer to questions 22 and 54 in the Use of Special Education Funds question and answer document, which is located on the Iowa Department of Education's website.
The 8th question, and under infrastructure and implementation, is how will the targeted and/or intensive tier options be implemented? For learners of special education services, it's appropriate to use special education funds to look at an intensive intervention that's completed during the 60-day special education evaluation timeline. And so if you have a student who already has services but maybe doesn't have services in the area of reading, or for a learner who already is receiving an evaluation, you can participate in any of the activities listed in steps 1 through 7, and so up until now, in collaboration with special education teachers or interventionists. For learners without special education services, you're able to provide occasional and incidental consultation to general education teachers or interventionists who are implementing targeted and/or intensive interventions. So for those people who are implementing the interventions, if they have questions around how to implement a specific intervention, if they have questions around fidelity or data collection, you're welcome to provide that consultation on an occasional and incidental basis. Additionally, you may support general education teachers or interventionists in reviewing intervention progress monitoring data to determine if a disability should be suspected. So as you're talking about suspicion or as you're analyzing those progress monitoring data for students on interventions, you can be a part of that work. Additionally, at times, teams may need support in planning logistics of intensive intervention delivery, and you are able to provide that support as well. And so consultation around those logistics is an appropriate use of special education funds.
Question 9 is all about implementation. How will the implementation of the targeted and intensive tiers be monitored over time? So once again, we're going to talk first about students who are already in special education. So for students who are already in special education or are receiving an intervention during the 60-day evaluation timeline, you can develop implementation checklists, implementation rubrics, implementation observation forms. You can help develop whatever you need in order to assess the implementation of the actual intervention during the 60 days or of specially designed instruction. In addition to developing the resources that might be used, you can also complete implementation checks for learners with special education services. So as a staff member who's funded by special education dollars, you might be going in and actually observing the instruction and using the observation form that you created to assess the implementation of the specially designed instruction. You also might provide support to the special education teacher or to the interventionist during the 60-day evaluation timeline to actually implement the action steps as intended or to implement modifications needed to the instruction, or to support high quality implementation of the specially designed instruction as planned. For learners who aren't in special education but are receiving general education, standard treatment protocol, or intensive interventions, you might be providing general education teachers or interventionists with information about the importance of implementation integrity, during the intensive intervention. We know that we need to make sure that staff members are implementing an intervention as intended in order to make good decisions about students' progress and the outcomes of those interventions. So you can talk to gen ed teachers and interventionists about the importance of that implementation integrity assessment. You can also provide teachers or interventionists with ideas of how to assess implementation integrity on an occasional and incidental basis. So for example, you might take some of those checklists or rubrics that you developed and have used with other students, and you might give those to a general education teacher for that teacher to complete on his or her own, but they're using your resource. That's an occasional and incidental contact with that teacher, and you're providing them with a resource, not actually doing the implementation check for them. You might also collaborate with the general education teacher or interventionist on the analysis of their implementation data. So once that general education teacher has completed the checklist for her own instruction during that general education intervention, she might bring back a summary graph of the implementation data, at which point you have a conversation with her about what are the implications of that data, what are they telling us, and what might we need to do differently in the future to ensure that we're getting high fidelity implementation of the intervention as planned.
And question 10 is really around evaluation. So the question is, using the data and information, which students need changes to the tiers they are receiving? So for learners with special education services, so those students with IEPs or who are in the 60-day evaluation process, you may provide consultation to special education teachers regarding the use of progress monitoring data to make educational decisions. So you may be consulting with them around progress monitoring data they have collected or around goals that they're setting around and the progress monitoring toward meeting those goals. You may also provide them with specific strategies to intensify instruction when needed. So you can help them further intensify their instruction and further target specific student needs. For learners without special education services, you may provide consultation to general education teachers and/or interventionists regarding the use of their progress monitoring data to make educational decisions. So once they have those data on an occasional and incidental basis, you may help them interpret those data. You may also provide strategies to modify an intervention. So if they need to intensify an intervention or modify it for another reason, you may again consult around that process on an occasional and incidental basis. And lastly, you may work with general education teachers or interventionists to review progress monitoring data with the purpose of determining if a disability should be suspected. So if you're talking about possible suspicion and you're looking at data to make those decisions, you may participate in those conversations.
So we've talked about consensus and we've talked about infrastructure and implementation. The last stage of development of MTSS that we want to talk about is sustainability. So here, the question we're looking at is, do you have an established structure to provide ongoing professional learning and coaching to support all staff members? So as a staff member who's funded entirely by special education dollars, how might I participate in supporting the work related to this question? You might provide professional learning opportunities to new staff members on the child find and suspicion of disability process. You might provide professional learning opportunities around eligibility determination and professional learning around intensification of instruction or specially designed instruction. If you are asked to provide professional learning opportunities to all new staff members on the entire MTSS process and system in a school building, that would not be an appropriate use of special ed funds because it's related to all kids and it's related to the general education instruction. It's not specifically related to students with disabilities. You might provide professional learning and coaching to teachers on how to accommodate or modify core instruction to better meet the needs of learners with special education services. So you might be meeting with general education teachers to talk to them about the students in their classroom who have IEPs for reading and what those students need in order to specifically address their needs. And you might be supporting them to help identify the accommodations and modifications needed in order to help those students be successful. You also might provide ongoing professional learning and coaching to support differentiation and core instruction for learners with special education services. We really want special education students to be accessing core instruction, and we might need to look at our differentiation and the use of that in the classroom in order to support those learners. So you might be the perfect person to provide that kind of professional learning for staff members. You also might provide ongoing professional learning and coaching to support collaborative teaching practices in the general education setting. So knowing that we are looking at collaborative teaching opportunities so that we can better support students with special education in the general education settings, you might provide professional development around that content or ongoing coaching and support to improve the quality of the collaborative teaching relationship.
Also related to sustainability, we consider how we ensure program evaluation at the universal targeted, and intensive tier levels. So you can support the evaluation of the effectiveness of special education services, and you may provide that support through doing several various activities. One might be to determine the number and percent of learners receiving specially designed instruction in a specific area. Our example is literacy because that's where we've started as a state in MTSS implementation, but it could expand to any area that you're evaluating. Additionally, you may determine the number and percent of those learners receiving specially designed instruction in literacy who made progress, met benchmark, and were exited for special education. As part of program evaluation, you might be reviewing progress data for learners with reading goals to determine if instructional changes were made when they were needed, as indicated by data. So looking to see, are we continuing to doing those evaluation processes and answering that test question 10 from infrastructure and implementation. You may also be reviewing implementation data to determine if specially designed instruction was implemented as intended. And so you may support the evaluation of the program evaluation of the effectiveness of special education services as part of your MTSS work.
What structures does the leadership team have in place to support sustainability of the framework over time is the last question in the sustainability section. So here you might be engaging in activities that help reflect the child find and problem solving process in your teacher handbook or your child find problem solving process documentation. We really want the MTSS system to be one continuum of services and processes for all kids. What we don't want is for MTSS to be one system and for child find and special education evaluation and problem solving to be a whole separate system. So you might be working to help support your leadership team in understanding how it's all part of one continuum and how you can make your general education interventions at Tier 2 or Tier 3 funnel into the child find process or child find and evaluation process, and helping them understand how students in special education are a part of all students and a part of the entire continuum. So you might be updating the teacher handbook or forms to reflect that philosophy.
So that concludes our comparison of MTSS, collaborative inquiry questions, and special education use of funds. For more information, you can find multiple documents on the Department of Education website that relate to special education use of funds, and that website is below. In addition, you can continue to use this document within your AEA and in LEAs as appropriate.
Thank you.